In the small village of Millbrook, where tradition runs as deep as the frozen river that cuts through its heart, everyone knew better than to venture onto the ice after the first thaw. Everyone except Elena Vasquez. When the massive white stallion crashed through the weakened surface, thrashing desperately in the icy water, the townspeople gathered on the bank, shaking their heads. "Let nature take its course," they murmured. "That beast is already dead." But Elena saw something different in those wild, pleading eyes. Against all reason and the harsh warnings of her neighbors, she waded into the bone-chilling water, risking everything to pull the dying animal to safety. They called her a fool. They said she was wasting her time on a lost cause. But what if the creature she saved wasn't just a horse at all? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Elena Vasquez had always been different from the other women in Millbrook, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. At 52, she possessed the kind of quiet strength that comes from weathering life's storms without losing one's essential gentleness. Her small cottage sat at the edge of town, where the manicured lawns gave way to wild meadows and the ancient oak trees that had witnessed generations of secrets. The morning light filtered through her kitchen window as she prepared her usual breakfast of oatmeal and honey, the same meal she'd shared with Miguel for 23 years of marriage. His workshop tools still hung neatly arranged on the pegboard beside the back door, each hammer and chisel exactly where he'd left them 3 years ago. Elena had tried many times to pack them away, but something always stopped her. Miguel had been a master carpenter, and these tools had shaped every piece of furniture in their home, every repair that kept their sanctuary strong against time's relentless march. Millbrook itself was a town caught between centuries. Founded in 1847 by settlers who claimed they'd been drawn to the valley by prophetic dreams, it had grown slowly and deliberately. The main street still featured the original cobblestone laid by those first families, though now it was bordered by a mixture of quaint shops and empty storefronts that spoke to harder times. The Millbrook General Store, where Elena bought her weekly supplies, had been in the Brennan family for 4 generations. The white-steepled church where she attended Sunday services had witnessed every wedding, funeral, and crisis the community had ever faced. Elena's reputation in town was that of a woman who kept to herself but could be counted on in times of need. When Mrs. Henderson's cat had gone missing last spring, Elena had spent 3 days searching the woods until she found the frightened animal trapped in an old well. When young Tommy Martinez had broken his arm falling from his bicycle, Elena had been the first to reach him, cradling the boy until the ambulance arrived from the county hospital 30 miles away. Her seamstress shop occupied the front room of her cottage, where she mended tiers and hemmed dresses for the few remaining families who hadn't moved away to find work in the cities. The Singer sewing machine had belonged to her grandmother, Isabella, a woman whose stories had filled Elena's childhood with tales of spirits that lived in the mountains and horses that could run between worlds. Elena's mother had dismissed these as old country superstitions, but Elena had always felt there was truth hidden beneath the folklore. The silver pendant that hung around Elena's neck had been Isabella's final gift, passed down through 3 generations of women who had all felt the pull of something greater than their ordinary lives. It was a simple piece, etched with symbols that seemed to shift in different lights. Warm against her skin, even on the coldest mornings, Elena had chosen not to have children, a decision that had puzzled and sometimes angered the more traditional members of the community. She and Miguel had been content with their quiet life, their shared love of books and long walks through the meadows, their unspoken understanding that some souls are meant to serve in different ways. Since Miguel's sudden heart attack, Elena had found solace in her daily routine of caring for the small animals that wandered onto her property. Stray cats appeared at her door and somehow never left. Injured birds recovered in makeshift nests she constructed in her garden shed. The local wildlife seemed to recognize her as a safe harbor, and she never questioned why her touch appeared to calm even the most frightened creatures. This morning felt different, though she couldn't explain why. The air carried an electric tension that made her grandmother's pendant feel heavier against her chest. The sparrows that usually gathered at her kitchen window seemed restless, and the ancient oak outside her door creaked and swayed despite the absence of wind. Elena finished her breakfast and walked to the window that overlooked the meadow leading down to the river. In the distance, she could see other early risers beginning their daily routines, but something drew her attention to the frozen waterway that divided their valley. The ice looked different today, somehow more fragile, as if winter's grip was loosening faster than usual for early March. She touched the pendant unconsciously and felt it warm beneath her fingers, the way it had on the morning Miguel died, the way it had when she was 7 years old and had found the injured deer in the woods behind her grandmother's house. The sound that shattered the morning calm was unlike anything Elena had ever heard. It began as a thunderous crack, followed by a splash that echoed off the surrounding hills like a gunshot. She dropped her coffee cup and ran outside without bothering to grab her coat, the pendant at her throat suddenly burning against her skin. Down by the river, a crowd was already gathering. Elena could see Mayor Brennan waving his arms and shouting instructions that nobody seemed to be following. As she hurried down the slope, her heart sank at what she saw in the water. The white stallion was magnificent, even in its desperation. Easily 17 hands high, with a coat that seemed to shimmer with its own inner light, the horse thrashed against the ice-cold current that threatened to drag it downstream. Its eyes, wide with terror, caught Elena's and held them with an intelligence that made her breath catch in her throat. "Somebody call Dr. Chen," Mayor Brennan was saying. "Though I don't know what good it'll do. That animal's a goner for sure. How did it even get out there?" asked Mrs. Henderson, wrapping her shawl tighter against the morning chill. "There's no way across the ice from either side." Elena pushed through the small crowd, her eyes never leaving the struggling horse. The pendant was so hot now it almost burned, and she could hear her grandmother's voice as clearly as if Isabella were standing beside her. "Sometimes, Midja, the world sends us exactly what we need. Even when we don't understand why. We should call animal control," suggested Tom Bradley from the hardware store. "Let them handle it proper. By the time they get here from the county, that horse will be frozen solid," replied Father Martinez, who had arrived with his morning coffee still steaming in his hands. "Shame, though. Beautiful animal." Elena stepped closer to the water's edge, ignoring the way the others fell silent to watch her. The horse's eyes found hers again, and in that moment she felt something pass between them. A recognition, a plea, a promise. "Elena, don't even think about it," Mayor Brennan warned, reading her intention in her posture. "That water's near freezing, and the current's stronger than it looks. You'll just end up drowning yourself trying to save something that's already dead." But Elena was already kicking off her shoes. The pendant pulsed against her chest like a second heartbeat, and she could swear she heard music in the air, the kind of ancient melody her grandmother used to hum while working in her garden. "Elena, stop." Dr. Sarah Chen had arrived, her veterinary bag in hand and her face set with professional concern. "Even if you could reach it, there's no way to get an animal that size out of the water. The bank's too steep and you don't have the equipment." Elena waded into the shallows, gasping as the icy water soaked through her pants. The horse was 20 feet from shore, fighting to keep its head above the surface. Its strength was fading. She could see it in the way its movements were becoming less coordinated, more desperate. "This is madness," muttered Tom Bradley. "Pure foolishness." The water reached Elena's waist now, and the cold was like knives against her skin. But the pendant's warmth spread through her chest, and she felt a strength that wasn't entirely her own, flowing into her limbs. The horse seemed to sense her approach and stopped thrashing. Its dark eyes locked on hers with something that looked remarkably like hope. "Come on, beautiful," Elena whispered, her voice barely audible over the water's sound. "Let's get you out of there." She reached for the horse's halter, and the moment her fingers touched the leather, the pendant flared with heat so intense she nearly cried out. The horse immediately calmed, as if her touch had activated some switch in its panicked mind. Together, step by agonizing step, Elena and the stallion fought their way back to shore. The horse seemed to understand exactly what was needed, using Elena as an anchor point while finding purchase with its hooves on the rocky bottom. The crowd on the bank had grown silent, watching in disbelief as the impossible rescue unfolded before their eyes. When they finally reached the shallows, Dr. Chen rushed forward with blankets and her medical bag. The horse stood on shaking legs, steam rising from its coat in the cold air, but its eyes remained alert and focused on Elena's face. "I've never seen anything like it," Dr. Chen murmured, running her hands over the animal's body to check for injuries. The water temperature alone should have sent it into shock. Elena collapsed onto the riverbank, her entire body shaking from cold and exhaustion. But as she looked up at the magnificent creature she'd just saved, she felt the pendant settle back to its normal warmth against her chest, and she knew with absolute certainty that her life had just changed forever. The emergency town meeting was called for 7 o'clock that evening in the community center, and Elena knew she was the main topic of discussion even before she walked through the doors. The murmur of voices died as she entered, still wearing the same clothes from her morning rescue, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail that made her look younger than her 52 years. Mayor Brennan stood at the front of the room, his weathered face showing the strain of a man trying to hold a community together with fewer resources each passing year. Behind him hung the town's memorial bell, a bronze piece cast in 1863 to honor the first generation of settlers. Elena had always found comfort in that bell's presence, the way it represented continuity and shared purpose. "Folks, we need to talk about what happened this morning," Brennan began, his voice carrying the authority of 20 years in office. "Elena did something brave, but it was also reckless. We can't have people risking their lives for lost causes." Elena found a seat in the back, trying to ignore the way conversation stopped as people turned to stare at her. She spotted Dr. Chen near the front, the veterinarian's professional demeanor masking whatever thoughts she might have about the horse's remarkable recovery. "The fact is," continued Tom Bradley, rising from his seat with the confidence of a man who'd never been wrong about anything, "we've got real problems in this town. Real human problems. We can't afford to waste time and resources on every stray animal that wanders through." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Elena knew the problems he was referring to. 3 families had moved away in the past year, seeking work in larger cities. The Henderson farm was behind on its mortgage. The general store was struggling to compete with the big box retailers 30 miles away. Furthermore, Bradley continued, warming to his theme, what Elena did this morning was dangerous. What if she'd drowned? What if someone else had tried to help and gotten hurt? We need to think about liability here. Mrs. Henderson stood up, her grey hair perfectly styled, despite the informal nature of the meeting. "I heard that Marcus Sterling is coming through town next week. You know, the developer from Kansas City. Maybe it's time we seriously considered his offer." The mention of Sterling's name sent a chill through the room that had nothing to do with the March weather. Elena had heard whispers about the developer who was buying up struggling rural communities, transforming them into luxury destinations for wealthy city dwellers seeking authentic country experiences. "Now hold on," said Father Martinez, his gentle voice carrying surprising authority. "This community was built by people who helped each other. What Elena did this morning was in that tradition." "Tradition doesn't pay the bills, Father," replied Bradley. "And it doesn't keep young people from leaving for the cities. Maybe it's time we stopped living in the past." Eleanor felt the familiar weight of the pendant against her chest, and she thought about her grandmother's stories. Isabella had always insisted that Millbrook was special, that the valley held secrets older than any of the families who'd settled there. But sitting in this room, full of worried faces and mounting bills, those stories felt like childhood fantasies. "I've been thinking about Sterling's offer too," admitted Jim Torres, who ran the small auto repair shop on Main Street. "My grandson asked me why I stay here when there's nothing for young people. I couldn't give him a good answer." Dr. Chen cleared her throat and stood. "Before we make any decisions about the future, I think you should know something about the horse Elena rescued. I've been a veterinarian for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like what I witnessed today." The room grew quiet, and Elena felt her heart begin to race. That animal should have died from hypothermia within minutes of hitting that water. Instead, by the time I examined it, its vital signs were completely normal. Its body temperature had regulated itself faster than any medical text would suggest is possible. "What are you saying, Doc?" asked Mayor Brennan. "I'm saying that sometimes things happen that don't fit our understanding of how the world works, and maybe, before we decide to sell our heritage to the highest bidder, we should consider whether there might be more to this place than we realize." Tom Bradley scoffed. "Are you suggesting that horse is magical? Come on, Doc, you're a woman of science." Elena stood up slowly, feeling every eye in the room turned toward her. The pendant seemed to pulse with warmth, and for a moment she thought she could hear the distant sound of horse hooves on stone. "My grandmother always said this valley was special," Elena said quietly. "Maybe it's time we asked ourselves why." 3 days after the rescue, Elena woke to find the white stallion standing in her garden, completely free of the makeshift shelter she'd built behind her cottage. The morning sun caught his coat in a way that made him seem to glow from within, and when he turned to look at her through the kitchen window, she could swear she saw ancient wisdom in those dark eyes. Dr. Chen arrived within an hour of Elena's phone call, carrying a worn leather journal that looked far older than her 40-something years would suggest. She moved around the horse with the careful precision of someone who'd spent her career reading the subtle signs of animal behavior. But Elena could see the confusion growing on her face with each passing minute. "His temperature is perfect," Dr. Chen murmured, pulling the stethoscope from her ears. "Pulse strong and steady, no signs of stress or trauma. Elena, this animal should be dead." Elena ran her fingers along the horse's neck, marveling at the way he leaned into her touch. The pendant against her chest had been warm since the moment she'd seen him in the garden, a gentle heat that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his breathing. "There's something I need to show you," Dr. Chen said, opening the leather journal with careful hands. "This belonged to my great-grandfather. He was the veterinarian here in Millbrook from 1923 to 1967. Most of it's standard medical notes, but there are entries that I've never understood." She flipped to a page marked with a faded ribbon and pointed to a passage written in careful script. Elena leaned closer to read. "The White Guardians appear in times of great change. They choose their human companions not through chance, but through bloodlines that carry the old knowledge." Sarah Morrison reported such a visitation in 1943, shortly before her discovery of the healing spring that saved the Henderson child. "Sarah Morrison was my great-great-grandmother," Elena whispered, her hand instinctively moving to the pendant. "She died when I was very young, but my grandmother always said she had a special gift with animals." Dr. Chen turned more pages, revealing sketches of horses that looked remarkably similar to the stallion standing before them. "There are 7 such accounts in here, spanning over 40 years. Each time, a white horse appeared to a woman in the Morrison family line during periods when the community faced some kind of crisis." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "What kind of crises?" "The bank threatening to foreclose on the church in 1929. The drought of 1936 that nearly destroyed every farm in the valley. The flood of 1952 that should have wiped the town off the map. Dr. Chen's voice grew quieter. Each time, something miraculous happened. The crisis passed. The community survived. The horse lifted his head as if listening to their conversation, and Elena noticed for the first time that his eyes seemed to change color slightly in different light, shifting from deep brown to something that almost looked like gold. "That's not all, Doctor," Chen continued. "Yesterday evening, I got calls from 3 different farmers. Jim Patterson's sick cow is suddenly healthy. Maria Santos found her missing sheep, all accounted for, and somehow fatter than when they disappeared 2 weeks ago. And old Pete Williams swears the apple trees that lightning killed last summer are showing new growth." Elena walked slowly around the horse, taking in details she'd missed during the dramatic rescue. His hooves seemed too perfect, with no chips or cracks, despite his apparent journey to reach the frozen river. His mane fell in waves that caught the light like spun silver, and there was something about his proportions that made him seem larger than life, as if he existed on a slightly different scale than ordinary horses. "Dr. Chen," Elena said carefully, "do you believe in things that can't be explained by science?" The veterinarian was quiet for a long moment, her hands absently stroking the journal's worn cover. "My great-grandfather wrote something else in here. He said that some truths are too important to be limited by what we think we understand about the world." As if responding to their conversation, the horse stepped closer to Elena and gently nuzzled her shoulder. The moment his breath touched her skin, she felt a rush of images flood her mind. Rolling green hills that stretched beyond the horizon. A woman who looked remarkably like her grandmother, standing beside a different white horse in what appeared to be the same garden decades earlier. And threading through it all, a sense of purpose so strong it made her knees weak. "He's been waiting for me," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how I know that, but I do." Dr. Chen nodded slowly. "The question is, waiting for you to do what?" Marcus Sterling arrived in Millbrook on a Thursday morning in a black Mercedes that looked like it had never touched a dirt road. Elena watched from her kitchen window as the car pulled up to the general store, its polished surface reflecting the morning light like a dark mirror against the town's weathered storefronts. Sterling himself was exactly what Elena had expected. Tall, impeccably dressed in a suit that probably cost more than most families in Millbrook made in a month, with the kind of confident smile that belonged to a man who'd never heard the word no applied to anything he truly wanted. By noon, he had commandeered the community center for what he called an information session. Elena found herself reluctantly drawn to attend, partly out of curiosity and partly because the white stallion had grown restless when Sterling's car first appeared, pacing the garden with an agitation she'd never seen in him before. Sterling had transformed the simple meeting room into a professional presentation space. A portable screen showed glossy images of luxury cabins nestled among pristine forests, happy families enjoying artisanal meals, and couples relaxing in spa facilities that looked like they belonged in a magazine. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sterling began, his voice carrying the polished cadence of someone accustomed to selling dreams. "What I'm offering you is the chance to be part of something revolutionary. Millbrook Valley Resort won't just be another development. It will be a destination that celebrates authentic, rural American life while providing the amenities that today's discerning travelers expect." Elena noticed the stack of contracts on the table beside Sterling's briefcase. Each one was thick with legal language and bound in expensive-looking folders. "The beauty of our model," Sterling continued, clicking to a new slide showing property value projections, "is that current residents don't have to leave. In fact, we're counting on you to stay. You'll be the authentic heart of the experience we're creating. Your stories, your traditions, your connection to the land, that's what our guests will be paying to experience." Mrs. Henderson raised her hand. "What exactly are you offering, Mr. Sterling?" "Excellent question. Sterling's smile widened. For those who choose to sell their properties to Millbrook Valley Development, we're offering market value plus a 30% premium. For those who prefer to stay, we're offering employment contracts as cultural ambassadors, along with fully renovated homes that meet our hospitality standards. Tom Bradley leaned forward in his seat. And what about people who don't want to participate at all? Something flickered behind Sterling's eyes, too quick for most people to catch. But Elena saw it, and she felt the pendant grow warm against her chest. Well, naturally, we hope everyone will see the benefits of progress. But we understand that change can be difficult. Those who choose not to participate will find themselves living alongside a thriving resort community. Property values will rise, services will improve, and opportunities will multiply. What he's not saying, murmured Father Martinez, speaking just loud enough for Elena to hear, is what happens to people who can't afford to live in a place where property values have tripled. Mayor Brennan stood up, his face showing the strain of a man caught between impossible choices. Mr. Sterling, what's your timeline for this project? We're hoping to begin the initial phase of development within 6 months. The sooner we can get community buy-in, the sooner we can start bringing prosperity to Millbrook. Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. 6 months. It wasn't much time to what? She wasn't even sure what she was supposed to be protecting, only that every instinct she'd inherited from generations of Morrison women was screaming that Sterling represented a threat to something precious and irreplaceable. I notice you haven't mentioned the environmental impact studies, Dr. Chen said from her seat near the front. A development of this size would require extensive surveys of local wildlife patterns, water table analysis, soil composition tests. Sterling's smile remained perfectly in place. But Elena caught that flicker again. Of course, Dr. Chen, all regulatory requirements will be met. In fact, we've already begun preliminary assessments. I think you'll find that our commitment to environmental stewardship is one of our strongest selling points. Elena stood up, feeling every eye in the room turned toward her. Mr. Sterling, what would happen to someone who refused to sell? As I mentioned, Mrs. Vasquez, isn't it? Property owners have every right to maintain their holdings. Though I imagine living on a small plot surrounded by resort development might feel rather isolated. The threat was delivered with such polished courtesy that it took a moment for its implications to settle over the room. Elena felt the pendant pulse against her chest, and through the community center's windows, she could see the white stallion standing at the edge of her property, his head raised and alert as if he were standing guard. That evening, Elena found herself drawn to her grandmother's old recipe book, a collection of handwritten cards and loose papers that had been passed down through 3 generations of Morrison women. She'd always assumed the remedies were simple folk medicine, teas for headaches and poultices for bruises, but tonight the familiar pages seemed to hold deeper secrets. The white stallion stood outside her kitchen window as she worked, his presence both comforting and somehow urgent. Every few minutes he would lift his head and look toward the center of town, as if sensing something Elena couldn't yet perceive, hidden between a recipe for elderberry syrup and instructions for preserving autumn vegetables. Elena found a page she'd never noticed before. The handwriting was different from her grandmother's usual careful script, more hurried, as if written in secret or under stress. The guardians of the old ways choose their vessels carefully, the passage began. When the white ones come, it means the balance is threatened. They appear to those who carry the bloodline, but bloodline alone is not enough. The chosen must be willing to see beyond the veil that separates the ordinary world from the realm of deeper truths. Elena's hands trembled as she read on. The text described rituals that seemed to blur the line between cooking and magic, measurements that included things like a pinch of moonlight and 3 drops of morning dew collected before the first bird sings. As she turned the page, a loose piece of paper fluttered to the floor. The handwriting on this one was even older, the ink faded to brown with age. At the top, in careful letters, was written, Isabella Morrison. 1962, my darling Elena, the letter began. If you are reading this, then the guardian has come for you, as I always knew it would. Do not be afraid, Mia. The gift that runs in our family is not a burden but a blessing, though it may not always feel that way. Elena sank into her kitchen chair, the letter shaking in her hands. Her grandmother had written this when Elena was just a child, somehow knowing that this moment would come. The white horses are older than the towns and older than the families who settled these valleys. They are protectors of the balance between what can be seen and what remains hidden. When forces arise that would destroy this balance, they choose a human partner to help them guard what must be preserved. Through the window, the stallion moved closer to the house. His ears pricked forward, as if he could hear Elena reading the letter that had been waiting for her for 40 years. You will know your true purpose when the time comes, but I can tell you this. The developer who threatens our valley is not the first of his kind, and he will not be the last. There are people in this world who see only profit where others see sacred ground. The guardian will show you how to protect what matters most. Elena looked up from the letter to find the horse watching her through the window, his eyes reflecting the kitchen light in a way that seemed almost supernatural. As their gazes met, she felt something shift in her perception, like adjusting the focus on a pair of binoculars. The world outside her window looked different now. She could see streams of light connecting her cottage to certain houses throughout the town, silver threads that pulsed with gentle energy. The threads converged at specific points: the old church, the memorial bell in the community center, the ancient oak tree that marked the center of the original settlement. But there were darker currents too, shadows that seemed to emanate from the hotel where Sterling was staying, creeping tendrils of something that made the pendant at Elena's throat grow cold. She returned to the letter, her heart racing as she read the final paragraph. The hardest part, my dear one, will be convincing others to believe what they cannot fully understand. But remember that belief is not required for truth to exist. The old ways have survived for centuries, hidden in plain sight, protected by women like us who understood that some things are too precious to be lost. Elena folded the letter fully and placed it back in the recipe book. Outside, the stallion nickered softly, and she realized he'd been waiting for her to discover what her grandmother had left behind. She walked to the back door and stepped outside. The March air was crisp and clean, but underneath the familiar sense of earth and growing things, she caught something else, something that made every instinct she'd inherited from. Generations of Morrison women go on high alert. The smell of smoke and metal and ambition that didn't belong in a place like Millbrook. The guardian stepped closer and gently nuzzled her shoulder. And in that moment of contact, Elena finally understood what she was meant to protect. The town split cleanly down the middle like a piece of wood struck by lightning. By the end of Sterling's second week in Millbrook, families who had shared Sunday dinners for generations found themselves unable to look each other in the eye. The Henderson farm posted a for sale sign that seemed to glow with possibility for some and betrayal for others. Elena spent her morning walking through the village with new eyes, seeing the streams of silver light that connected the sacred places her grandmother's letter had mentioned. The founding charter of Millbrook hung in a glass case at the town hall, a document most residents had never bothered to read carefully. But when Elena studied it now, certain phrases seemed to shimmer with hidden meaning. Founded upon the blessed ground where earth and sky converge, read one passage that she'd previously dismissed as flowery 19th century language. For the protection and preservation of the natural order against those forces that would seek to corrupt the ancient balance. Father Martinez found her there, his coffee cup steaming in the cool morning air. Interesting reading, he asked, settling onto the bench beside her. Father, do you think the original settlers knew something we've forgotten? He was quiet for a long moment, studying the charter through its protective glass. My predecessor left some notes when he retired, old journals mostly. He mentioned that the church records from the 1800s contained some unusual entries: blessings for the protection of sacred groves, ceremonies to honor the guardians of the valley. Elena felt the pendant warm against her chest. What kind of guardians? The kind that some would call superstition and others would call faith. Father Martinez sipped his coffee thoughtfully. I've been wondering lately if the difference between the two is smaller than we think. That afternoon brought the first open confrontation between the two sides of the divided community. Sterling had set up a temporary office in the old Brennan building, complete with architectural models and financial projections that painted a picture of prosperity that many found impossible to resist. Tom Bradley emerged from the building with a signed contract, his face wearing the expression of a man who'd just solved all his problems or created new ones he couldn't yet imagine. Within an hour, 3 more families had followed his lead, but resistance was forming too. Dr. Chen had begun documenting the unusual animal healings that continued to occur throughout the valley. Maria Santos reported that her prize bull, declared infertile by veterinarians in the county seat, had somehow regained his vigor. Pete Williams swore his dead apple trees were not only growing new leaves, but bearing fruit out of season. Elena found herself at the center of the resistance almost by accident. People who had lived their entire lives in Millbrook began stopping by her cottage to share stories they'd never told before. Mrs. Patterson confessed that her great-grandmother had spoken to the spirits of the oak trees. Young Tommy Martinez admitted that sometimes he could hear music in the wind that seemed to carry messages from the mountains. The white stallion had taken to walking the boundaries of the town each evening, following paths that seemed random to casual observers, but that Elena now recognized as deliberate patrol routes. He was marking territory, she realized, or perhaps reinforcing barriers that existed on a level most people couldn't perceive. Sterling noticed the horse's behavior too. Elena watched from her window as the developer stood at the edge of her property line, studying the stallion with the calculating gaze of a man trying to solve a problem. The horse stared back with an intensity that made Sterling take several steps backward. "That animal is becoming a nuisance," Sterling announced at the next town meeting. "We have liability concerns about an uncontrolled horse wandering through a community where we're planning to welcome families with children." "The horse isn't hurting anyone," Elena replied, standing to face him across the crowded room. "In fact, some might say he's helping to heal this place." Sterling's smile remained perfectly professional, but Elena caught the flash of something harder behind his eyes. "Mrs. Vasquez, surely you understand that progress requires us to move beyond old superstitions. We can't allow sentiment to stand in the way of economic opportunity." Mayor Brennan looked older than Elena had ever seen him, caught between forces he didn't fully understand. "What are you suggesting, Mr. Sterling?" "I'm suggesting that if the horse truly belongs to no one, then animal control should relocate it to a more appropriate environment. Somewhere it won't interfere with our development timeline." The room erupted in arguments that quickly became personal. Neighbors who had helped each other through droughts and floods now shouted across the aisle about progress versus tradition, practical needs versus sentimental foolishness. Elena felt the founding charter's words echoing in her mind. For the protection and preservation of the natural order against those forces that would seek to corrupt the ancient balance, she finally understood what she was really fighting for. The revelation came to Elena in the pre-dawn hours. When the veil between worlds grows thin, she woke to find the white stallion standing beside her bed, somehow having entered her cottage without disturbing so much as a floorboard. His eyes held depths that seemed to contain centuries of accumulated wisdom, and when he lowered his great head to touch her forehead, the world exploded into visions. She saw Millbrook Valley as it had been before the settlers arrived, a place where streams of silver light converged like the spokes of a vast wheel. Ancient peoples had recognized this convergence and built stone markers to channel and protect the energies that flowed here. The stones were still there. Elena realized, with sudden clarity, hidden beneath modern foundations and disguised as property boundaries. But the most profound revelation was about the stallion himself. He was not merely a mystical creature, but one of the ancient guardians, beings who had walked between worlds since the first stories were told around the first fires. His kind appeared when the balance between the seen and unseen was threatened, choosing human partners from bloodlines that carried the old knowledge. You are the last of the Morrison line in this place. His voice spoke directly into her mind, carrying the weight of mountains and the patience of centuries. When the silver threads that protect this valley are severed, the corruption will spread far beyond these borders. I cannot stop what is coming alone. Elena found herself standing in her grandmother's garden, though she had no memory of leaving her bed. Dawn was breaking over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that seemed more vivid than any sunrise she'd ever witnessed. The ancient stone marker that had always stood at the edge of her property was glowing with soft silver light, and she could see similar markers throughout the valley, all connected by threads of energy that pulsed like a great heartbeat. The developer knows what he seeks to destroy, the Guardian continued. He serves forces that feed on disruption and chaos. Each place of power they corrupt makes them stronger, and the world a little darker. Elena touched the stone marker, feeling warmth flow up through her fingertips and into her heart. Images flooded her consciousness. Her great-great-grandmother Sarah, standing beside a previous guardian in this same garden during the drought of 1936. Her grandmother, Isabella, working with the White Horse to heal the flood damage of 1952. 3 generations of Morrison women, each serving as the bridge between the ancient protections and the human community they shielded. But I don't know how. Elena whispered aloud. I'm just a seamstress. I don't have any special powers. The Guardian stepped closer, and Elena could feel the warmth radiating from his coat, like standing near a hearth fire on a winter evening. The power has always been within you. It flows in your blood and speaks in your hands. Every creature you have healed, every broken thing you have mended, every act of compassion you have offered, without thought of reward, has been preparing you for this moment. As if to demonstrate his words, Elena looked at her hands and saw them glowing with the same soft silver light that emanated from the stone markers. The pendant at her throat was no longer just warm but blazing, with an inner fire that should have burned her skin but instead filled her with strength she'd never imagined. Possessing Sterling's construction will begin in 3 days, the Guardian told her. He plans to start with the oak tree at the center of town, the one your people call the heart of Millbrook. When that tree falls, the first barrier will collapse and the corruption will begin to spread. Elena nodded, understanding flooding through her like water through parched earth. The oak tree wasn't just a landmark, it was the anchor, point for all the protective energies that had kept the valley safe for more than a century. Its roots ran deep enough to touch the underground streams of power, and its branches reached high enough to channel the energies from the sky. "How do we stop him?" she asked. The Guardian's eyes seemed to smile, though his expression remained solemn. "We remind this community what they truly are. We show them that some things are more valuable than money, and that the old ways have power the new world has forgotten." Elena felt the silver light flowing through her intensify, and she realized that she was no longer the same woman who had waded into an icy river to save a dying horse. She was something new, something that bridged the gap between the mystical and the mundane, between the ancient protections and the modern world that had almost forgotten they existed. The transformation was complete, and the real battle was about to begin. Elena's fingers traced the intricate carvings on the hand-carved wooden whistle her grandmother had left buried in the recipe box, hidden beneath layers of dried herbs and faded photographs. The whistle was no larger than her thumb, crafted from wood so old it had taken on the color of burnished gold, and etched with symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the morning light. According to Isabella's notes, the whistle was used to call the hidden allies, those who had always lived alongside the human community but remained unseen unless great need arose. Elena had spent the morning practicing the specific sequence of notes her grandmother had carefully transcribed. Though she wasn't entirely sure what would answer the call, the guardian stood in her garden, his silver coat catching the dawn light as he watched her with patient eyes. Since their mystical connection had been established, Elena could feel his presence like a warm current in her mind, offering guidance without overwhelming her own thoughts. The old alliances run deeper than most people remember, his voice whispered in her consciousness. Your grandmother knew this valley held more than human residents. Elena lifted the whistle to her lips and played the haunting melody Isabella had preserved. The notes seemed to carry farther than physics should have allowed, echoing off the mountains and weaving through the trees with a resonance that made her bones vibrate. At first, nothing happened. Then she heard them responding from the deep woods, calls that sounded like bird songs but carried too much intelligence, rustling in the undergrowth that moved against the wind, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of hoofbeats on stone where no roads existed. Dr. Chen arrived within the hour, her veterinary bag slung over her shoulder and her great-grandfather's journal clutched in her hands. Elena, something extraordinary is happening. I've had calls from every farm in a 20-mile radius. Animals that have been sick for months are suddenly healthy. Wild creatures are gathering at the edge of properties as if they're waiting for something. Father Martinez appeared next, walking up the path from town with a thoughtful expression and a leather satchel that Elena had never seen before. I spent the night in the church archives, he said without preamble. There are records going back to the founding that I've never paid proper attention to. Blessing ceremonies for the forest guardians, protection rites for the valley spirits, treaties between the human settlers and what the records call the elder residents. Elena felt a surge of relief that she wasn't facing this alone. Father, do you believe in the elder residents? He opened his satchel and withdrew a collection of wooden medallions carved with symbols that matched those on Elena's whistle. My predecessor left these with a note saying they should be given to anyone who heard the guardian's call. I think I'm beginning to understand what he meant. The first of the mystical allies appeared as the three humans stood discussing the ancient records. It materialized from the shadow of the oak tree like smoke-given substance, a creature that might have been a deer if deer grew to the size of draft horses and possessed eyes that held the wisdom of centuries. Its antlers were adorned with ribbons of silver light that moved independently of any breeze. More followed throughout the morning. Wolves that walked on mist, their forms shifting between solid and ethereal. Birds with wingspans too large for any species Elena recognized, their feathers seeming to contain captured starlight. A family of bears that appeared translucent in bright sunlight, but solid as stone in the shadows. Dr. Chen documented everything with the methodical precision of a scientist, though Elena could see her worldview expanding with each impossible creature that emerged from the woods. They've always been here, she murmured, sketching a wolf whose fur seemed to be made of moonbeams. We just forgot how to see them. The guardian moved among the assembled creatures like a general reviewing troops, and Elena realized this was exactly what was happening. These beings had been protecting the valley alongside the human guardians for generations, invisible defenders of the sacred balance that Sterling's development threatened to destroy. We are not enough to stop what comes, the great deer spoke, its voice resonating like wind through ancient trees. The corruption has deeper roots than this valley. The destroyer serves powers that have been growing stronger while the old ways weakened. Elena felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. Then we need more than mystical allies. We need the human community to understand what they're truly protecting. Father Martinez nodded slowly. The blessing medallions. If people wear them, they should be able to see what we're seeing. And then what? Dr. Chen asked, looking up from her sketches. How do we convince an entire town to believe in something that science says is impossible? The guardian's mental voice carried a note of ancient humor. Sometimes, Elena, The most powerful magic is simply showing people the truth they've always known but forgotten how to see. The rumble of heavy machinery shattered the dawn quiet, like thunder rolling across a clear sky. Elena woke to the sound of Sterling's mechanical excavator grinding to life, its diesel engine coughing black smoke into the crisp morning air. Through her bedroom window, she could see the massive yellow machine positioned at the base of the ancient oak tree. Its hydraulic arm extended like a mechanical claw, reaching for the heart of Millbrook. Sterling had moved faster than anyone expected. While the community slept, his construction crew had arrived under cover of darkness, setting up equipment and establishing a perimeter around the town center. Orange safety cones and yellow caution tape transformed the familiar landmark into a construction zone, as if bureaucracy alone could strip away 2 centuries of sacred significance. Elena threw on her clothes and ran outside, the Guardian already at her side, his silver coat gleaming with agitation. The mystical allies she'd summoned the day before remained hidden in the shadows, but she could feel their presence like electricity in the air, waiting for her signal. Mayor Brennan stood helplessly at the edge of the construction zone, still in his pajamas and looking older than his 68 years. "He says he has all the permits," Brennan called to Elena as she approached. "County environmental clearance, state construction permits, even federal approval for the water and septic systems." Sterling emerged from a white trailer that hadn't been there the night before, dressed in work clothes that still managed to look expensive. His smile was as polished as ever, but Elena could see the dark currents flowing around him now, shadows that reached out like grasping fingers toward the silver threads that protected the valley. "Mrs. Vasquez," Sterling called cheerfully. "I hope the noise didn't wake you too early. We're just getting started with the initial site preparation. Nothing that can't be undone if the community changes its mind about progress." But Elena could see the lie in the darkness that surrounded him. Once the excavator's blade bit into the oak's roots, once the first barrier fell, there would be no going back. The corruption would spread like poison through water, turning the valley's protective energies against themselves. "You can't do this," Elena said, stepping forward despite the construction crew's warning gestures. "That tree is protected. It's been here since before the town was founded. Mrs. Vasquez, I appreciate your concern for local history, but trees grow back. Progress doesn't wait for sentiment." Sterling nodded to the excavator operator. "Jack, let's show these folks what the future looks like." The massive machine lurched forward, its steel treads chewing gouges in the earth that had never known such violence. The hydraulic arm swung toward the oak's base, and Elena felt the Guardian's mental voice roar with fury that made her mind ring like a struck bell. That's when the first miracle happened. The excavator's engine coughed, sputtered, and died. The operator tried the ignition repeatedly, but the machine remained silent. Sterling's face darkened, and he stalked over to inspect the equipment personally. "Probably just flooded the engine," he muttered. But Elena could see his confidence wavering. This was not part of his carefully orchestrated plan. A second excavator rumbled to life from the equipment yard Sterling had established behind the general store. This one was larger, more powerful, and operated by a different crew member who attacked the oak with renewed determination. The machine made it 3 feet before its hydraulics failed catastrophically, spraying fluid across the sacred ground in a pattern that looked almost like ancient symbols. The operator climbed down from the cab, shaking his head in confusion. "Never seen anything like it, Mr. Sterling. It's like the machine just gave up." By now, a crowd had gathered. Townspeople emerged from their homes in various stages of dress, drawn by the commotion and the growing sense that something significant was happening at the heart of their community. Elena noticed that several people were wearing Father Martinez's blessing medallions, and their faces showed the dawning awareness of those who were beginning to see beyond the ordinary world. Mrs. Henderson pointed toward the tree line with a trembling finger. "What are those lights moving in the forest?" Dr. Chen stepped forward, her great-grandfather's journal open in her hands. "Those aren't lights," she said quietly. "Those are the spirits of the valley, and they're not happy." Sterling's carefully maintained composure cracked for the first time since he'd arrived in Millbrook. He could sense that forces beyond his understanding were gathering, and Elena realized that he was beginning to comprehend the true scope of what he'd chosen to challenge. The Guardian stepped out from behind Elena, no longer bothering to hide his supernatural nature. His coat blazed with silver fire, and his eyes held depths that seemed to contain the accumulated wisdom of ages. When he spoke, his voice carried on the wind, so that every person present could hear it clearly. "This valley is under our protection. Leave now and take your corruption with you." What followed could only be described as a battle between two different versions of reality. Sterling's response to the Guardian's warning was to pull out his phone and make a series of increasingly urgent calls. Within an hour, 3 more construction crews arrived, along with a team of men in dark suits who looked more like corporate security than building inspectors. But as Sterling's forces gathered, so did the mystical defenders of the valley. The air itself seemed to thicken with power, and Elena found herself at the center of energies that made her hair stand on end, and her grandmother's pendant burn like a star against her chest. The Heartstone materialized first, rising from the earth beneath the oak tree like a crystal sunrise. Elena had seen it in her visions, but witnessing it in physical reality took her breath away. The stone was roughly the size of a person, multifaceted like a massive diamond, and it pulsed with light that seemed to originate from the very center of the earth. "That wasn't there yesterday," Mayor Brennan whispered, his voice filled with the wonder of a man whose entire understanding of the world was being rewritten in real time. Sterling stared at the crystal with naked hunger, and Elena realized with horror that he'd known it was there all along. The Heartstone wasn't just an obstacle to his development plans, it was his actual target. "Get that thing out of the ground," Sterling barked at his construction crews. "I don't care what it takes." The third excavator approached the crystal, its operator clearly nervous about attacking something that seemed to be generating its own light. When the steel blade struck the Heartstone, the impact rang out like a bell the size of a cathedral, and sparks of pure energy scattered in all directions. That's when the mystical battle truly began. The Guardian's call rang out across the valley, a sound that was part horse's whinny and part ancient war cry. In response, the forest exploded with movement. The spirit deer bounded from the tree line, their silver antlers leaving trails of light as they charged Sterling's equipment. The spectral wolves materialized around the construction site, their forms shifting between mist and flesh as they surrounded the startled workers. But Sterling had brought more than human allies. As the battle intensified, Elena saw them emerging from the shadows cast by his trailer and equipment, creatures of smoke and shadow that moved with predatory grace, beings that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. These were the servants of the corruption Sterling represented, entities that fed on destruction and grew stronger. With each sacred place they helped to defiled. Elena felt the Guardian's power flowing through her as she stepped toward the Heartstone. The crystal responded to her approach, its pulsing light intensifying until it painted the entire town center in shifting patterns of silver and gold. She placed her hands on its surface and felt the accumulated protective energies of generations flow into her consciousness. The Heartstone was more than a focus for the valley's mystical defenses. It was a repository of every act of love, courage, and sacrifice that had taken place in Millbrook since the first settlers had recognized this as sacred ground. Elena could feel the presence of her grandmother, her great-great-grandmother, and all the Morrison women who had served as guardians before her, their strength adding to her own. "You cannot have it," Elena said, her voice carrying with supernatural authority that made the shadow creatures recoil. "This place is protected by bonds older than your greed and stronger than your machinery." Sterling's facade of corporate politeness finally cracked completely. "That crystal is worth more than this entire miserable town," he snarled. "Do you have any idea what kind of power source something like that represents?" "The applications are limitless." "Exactly," Elena replied, understanding flooding through her like dawn breaking over mountains. "Which is why it must never fall into hands like yours." The Heartstone's light intensified further, and Elena realized she was channeling not just the mystical energies of the valley, but the will of everyone who had ever called Millbrook home. The townspeople who wore Father Martinez's blessing medallions began to see the full scope of the battle unfolding before them. Not just construction equipment versus trees, but the forces of ancient protection against the servants of corruption and greed. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, her blessing medallion glowing against her chest. "I may not understand what's happening here, but I know which side I'm on." Others followed her lead. Tom Bradley, who had signed Sterling's contract just days before, walked over to the developer and tore the papers in half. "Some things aren't for sale." The shadow creatures howled as the community's unified will strengthened the Heartstone's power. And Elena realized that Sterling's greatest weakness was his inability to comprehend that some battles couldn't be won with money or force alone. The transformation began with Elena's pendant, which had been growing steadily warmer throughout the battle. As the Heartstone's energy flowed through her, the simple silver medallion Isabella had left her began to change, its surface rippling like liquid mercury before solidifying into something entirely new. The pendant now blazed with its own inner light. No longer a passive family heirloom, but an active conduit for the ancient powers that protected the valley. Elena could feel the change spreading through her body, not painful but profound, as if every cell was being rewritten to accommodate energies she'd never been designed to contain. Sterling backed away from the Heartstone as its radiance intensified, his shadow creatures retreating to the edges of the construction site. "This isn't over!" he shouted over the sound of crystalline chimes that seemed to emanate from the stone itself. "You can't hide behind a superstition forever." But the Guardian stepped forward, his form growing larger and more imposing with each stride. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of mountains and the patience of geological time. "I am older than your civilization and more enduring than your greed. This valley has been under my protection since your ancestors first learned to make fire. You have no power here." The white stallion's true nature was revealing itself layer by layer. Elena could see through her transformed vision that he was not merely a mystical horse, but something far more ancient and powerful, a being that existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions, anchored to this reality by his bond with the Morrison bloodline, but extending into realms beyond human comprehension. Sterling's response was to pull what looked like a small device from his pocket, something that hummed with electronic malevolence. "Old magic meets new technology," he said with a smile that belonged on a predator. "Let's see how your ancient protections handle modern solutions." The device emitted a pulse of energy that made Elena's teeth ache and sent ripples of distortion through the air around the Heartstone. For a moment, the crystal's light flickered, and she felt the protective barriers of the valley waver like fabric in a strong wind. "Frequency disruptor," Dr. Chen said grimly, recognizing the technology from her research into animal behavior modification. "It's designed to interfere with natural energy patterns." But Elena found herself smiling, expression that surprised her with its confidence. The pendant at her throat pulsed in rhythm with the Heartstone, and she realized that Sterling had made a critical miscalculation. He'd assumed that the old magic would be vulnerable to modern interference. But what he didn't understand was that the ancient powers were far more adaptable than his technology. "You're thinking too small," Elena told him, stepping closer to the Heartstone until her hands were touching its surface. "You see old versus new, magic versus science, but that's not how this works at all." The crystalline structure began to resonate. not fighting against Sterling's frequency disruptor, but harmonizing with it, transforming the destructive energy into something that strengthened rather than weakened the valley's protections. Elena could feel the process happening through her transformed pendant, the ancient wisdom learning from and incorporating the modern challenge. Sterling's confidence wavered as his device began to smoke and spark. That's impossible. The interference patterns should be disrupting the crystalline matrix. The crystalline matrix is learning, Elena said with wonder in her voice. It's not just old magic, Mr. Sterling. It's intelligence that's been watching and growing for millennia. Your technology isn't destroying it. It's teaching it new ways to protect what matters. The Heartstone's light shifted, taking on frequencies that made Sterling's shadow creatures writhe and retreat further. The mystical deer and wolves that had been battling the darkness pressed forward, their forms becoming more solid and powerful as the crystal's enhanced energy flowed through them. Elena felt the final stage of her transformation beginning, her consciousness expanding to encompass not just her own thoughts, but the collective awareness of every guardian who had ever protected this valley. She was still herself, still the seamstress who had waded into icy water to save a dying horse. But she was also something more, a bridge between the human community and the ancient powers that had kept them safe for generations. The pendant's transformation was complete now, no longer silver, but something that seemed to contain captured starlight. When Elena looked at her reflection in the Heartstone's faceted surface, she saw that her own eyes had changed too, now holding depths that reflected the same ageless wisdom she'd first seen in the Guardian's gaze. Sterling's device finally exploded in a shower of sparks, and the developer stumbled backward as the shadow creatures he'd brought with him began to dissolve in the Heartstone's enhanced radiance. "This valley is truly protected now," Elena said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the very air shimmer with power. "And I am its guardian." The emergency town meeting 3 days later bore no resemblance to the heated arguments that had divided Millbrook just a week earlier. Mayor Brennan had called the assembly to officially address Sterling's hasty departure and to vote on what he was calling the future of our community, but the real purpose was to formalize what everyone already understood. Their town had fundamentally changed. Elena sat in the front row, the transformed pendant resting against her chest like a small star. The Guardians stood outside the community center windows, visible to everyone who wore one of Father Martinez's blessing medallions, which now included nearly the entire population. The white stallion's presence had become a source of comfort rather than mystery, a reminder that Millbrook was protected by forces more powerful than economic pressure or corporate greed. The new village charter lay on the table before Mayor Brennan, its pages filled with language that would have seemed like fantasy just a week ago. Dr. Chen had worked with Father Martinez to draft the document, incorporating both legal terminology and acknowledgments of the mystical realities that could no longer be ignored. "The first order of business," Brennan announced, his voice carrying new authority that came from having witnessed miracles firsthand, "is to formally recognize Millbrook as a protected sanctuary, both under state environmental law and under other protections that this community has recently rediscovered." Tom Bradley stood up, his face showing the transformation of a man who had briefly chosen money over meaning and learned from the experience. "Mr. Mayor, I move that we accept the new charter as written, and I want to formally apologize to Elena and to this community for nearly selling something that can't be replaced at any price." The vote was unanimous, though Elena noticed that the process felt more like a ritual than a political decision. Each person who voted yes felt the gentle warmth of acceptance from the valley's mystical protectors, as if the land itself was acknowledging the renewed covenant between the human community and the ancient powers. "Mayor." Brennan opened the leather portfolio that contained Sterling's abandoned development contracts. These documents are now void, of course. Mr. Sterling left town rather suddenly, along with his entire construction crew. I suspect we won't be hearing from Millbrook Valley Development again. Elena smiled, remembering the developer's panicked retreat as his shadow creatures dissolved and his technology failed. The Guardian had made it clear that Sterling was no longer welcome in the valley, and the man had apparently decided not to test the limits of ancient patience. Which brings us to the question of economic sustainability, Dr. Chen said, standing with a folder of her own. We can't just be a protected sanctuary. We need to be a thriving community that can support the families who choose to stay here. Elena had been thinking about this challenge ever since her transformation. The Guardian had shown her visions of other protected places around the world, communities that had found ways to honor their mystical heritage while remaining connected to the modern world. I've been in contact with the University of Colorado's Folklore Studies Department, Dr. Chen continued. They're interested in establishing a research station here to study what they're calling persistent cultural traditions in rural communities. It would bring visiting scholars, graduate students, and research funding to Millbrook, Father Martinez added. The diocese has expressed interest in recognizing our church as a pilgrimage site for people seeking connection with what they're calling authentic spiritual experiences. It would be respectful tourism, focused on meditation and reflection rather than commercialization. Elena felt the Guardian's approval flowing through their mental connection. This was how protected places survived in the modern world, by sharing their gifts carefully with those who approached with respect and genuine seeking. There's something else, Elena said, standing to address the community that had become her extended family. Other Guardian sites are reaching out to us. Places where the old protections are weakening and communities are struggling to maintain the balance. We could become a center for teaching others how to protect their own sacred spaces. Mrs. Henderson raised her hand. Does this mean people will be coming here to learn about what we've learned? Elena nodded. People who are ready to see beyond the ordinary world. People whose communities are facing the same kind of threats Sterling represented. We could teach them what we've remembered about living in harmony with the ancient powers. The vision was taking shape as Elena spoke. Millbrook as a beacon for communities seeking to rediscover their own mystical heritage. A place where ancient wisdom could be shared with modern seekers. Where the old ways could inform new solutions to timeless challenges. Mayor Brennan smiled as he signed the new charter with a fountain pen that had belonged to the town's first mayor. All in favor of Millbrook's new mission as a protected sanctuary and teaching center? Once again, the vote was unanimous, and Elena felt the heartstone pulse with approval from its resting place beneath the ancient oak tree. 6 months after Sterling's defeat, Elena's cottage had become the unofficial headquarters for a network that stretched across 3 continents. The network communication crystals that the Guardian had helped her attune sat on her kitchen windowsill like ordinary quartz specimens, but their soft inner glow revealed their true nature to anyone with the sight to see beyond surface appearances. This morning brought messages from Guardian communities in the Scottish Highlands, where an ancient stone circle was threatened by wind farm development, and from a village in rural Japan, where a sacred grove faced destruction for a shopping center. Each crystal pulsed with its own rhythm, carrying requests for guidance from people who had discovered their own mystical heritage and needed help protecting it. Elena had never imagined that saving one horse would connect her to a global network of guardians, but the pattern was becoming clear. As the old ways awakened in one place, they strengthened elsewhere, creating ripples of protection that spread far beyond any single valley or community. Dr. Chen arrived for their weekly consultation, her arms full of correspondence from universities and research institutions around the world. The Folklore Studies Department at Colorado wants to expand their program, she reported, settling into Elena's kitchen with the ease of long friendship. They're proposing a full field school here next summer, with courses in traditional ecological knowledge and indigenous spirituality. Elena poured tea from the pot that had belonged to her grandmother, noting how the simple ceramic seemed to hold warmth longer than physics would suggest. Many ordinary things in Millbrook had developed subtle enhancements since the Heartstone's activation, as if the valley's protective energies were gradually suffusing everything within the sacred boundaries. What about the medical applications? Elena asked. Dr. Chen had been documenting the healing effects that visitors to Millbrook experienced, trying to find ways to quantify what the Guardian's presence accomplished. Remarkable and completely inexplicable by conventional standards, Dr. Chen replied with the satisfaction of a scientist who had learned to embrace mystery. Pain reduction in chronic conditions, accelerated healing in acute injuries, and psychological improvements that persist long after people return home. I'm writing papers that would have gotten me laughed out of medical school 5 years ago. Through the window, Eleanor could see a group of visitors participating in one of Father Martinez's morning meditation sessions beneath the ancient oak. The priest had developed a program that introduced newcomers to the valley's mystical properties gradually, helping them recognize their own latent sensitivities without overwhelming them with too much revelation too quickly. Sterling tried to contact the mayor yesterday. Dr. Chen mentioned casually, though Eleanor caught the tension beneath her words. Elena felt the Guardian's immediate attention through their mental link. What did he want? Apparently his development company is facing some kind of investigation. Environmental violations at his other projects, financial irregularities, that sort of thing. He was asking if Millbrook might consider a settlement in exchange for dropping our restraining order against him. Elena smiled, touching the transformed pendant that now served as her direct connection to the valley's protective network. What did Mayor Brennan tell him? That some things can't be bought, sold, or settled, and that Mr. Sterling should consider himself fortunate that the Guardian is more merciful than he deserved. The conversation was interrupted by a gentle chiming from the communication crystals. Elena approached the windowsill and placed her hand on the stone that connected her to the Scottish Highland community. Images flowed into her consciousness, ancient standing stones surrounded by construction equipment, a family whose bloodline reached back to the original stone builders, and a developer who bore an unsettling resemblance to Sterling's ruthless ambition. They need help, Elena said, already understanding what was required. The standing stones are anchor points for protections that cover half of Scotland. If they fall, the corruption will spread across the entire region. Dr. Chen looked up from her correspondence. Are you thinking of traveling there? Elena considered the question seriously. The Guardian had shown her that her role was expanding beyond Millbrook's boundaries, that the network of protected places needed coordinators who could travel between sites and share knowledge across great distances. Not yet, she decided. But we can send them guidance, and we can connect them to the other communities that have faced similar challenges. She activated the crystal network, feeling her consciousness expand to touch the minds of Guardians around the world. In New Zealand, a Maori family was protecting a sacred mountain from mining interests. In Peru, indigenous communities were defending ancestral burial grounds from archaeological exploitation. In Maine, a coastal village was fighting offshore development that threatened mystical seal populations. Each battle was unique, but the underlying pattern was always the same. Ancient powers versus modern greed, spiritual values versus material profit, communities versus corporations that saw only resources where others saw sacred heritage. Elena began composing the mental message that would carry her hard-won wisdom across the ocean to Scotland, sharing the knowledge that had saved Millbrook and could now help others protect their own mystical inheritance. 1 year after the Heartstone's awakening, Elena stood in her transformed workshop, a space that had evolved far beyond its original purpose as a seamstress's repair room. The walls now held tools and artifacts gathered from guardian communities around the world, carved stones that hummed with protective energy, crystals that could store and transmit ancient wisdom, and weaving looms that created textiles, embedded with patterns that strengthened mystical barriers. The workshop had become a training center where Elena taught others to recognize and nurture their own guardian heritage. This morning's student was Maria Santos, a young woman whose grandmother had passed down stories about the spirits that lived in the mountains, and who had recently discovered that those stories were more than folklore. The key is understanding that the tools are extensions of your intention, Elena explained, guiding Maria's hands as they worked together to attune a protective amulet. The crystal holds power, but you provide the purpose and direction. Maria's amulet began to glow with soft amber light, and Elena felt the familiar satisfaction of watching someone discover abilities they'd never known they possessed. The Guardian network was growing stronger with each new person who learned to access their heritage, creating a web of protection that spanned continents. The sound of a car engine interrupted their lesson, and Elena looked out to see a vehicle she didn't recognize pulling up to her cottage. The driver who emerged was Sterling, though he looked nothing like the confident developer who had threatened their valley a year ago. His expensive suit had been replaced by simple work clothes, and his face showed the kind of weariness that comes from profound personal reckoning. Elena felt the Guardian's immediate alertness through their mental connection, but there was no sense of threat this time. The white stallion appeared at the edge of the garden, watchful but not hostile, as if he could sense that Sterling's intentions had fundamentally changed. "Mrs. Vasquez," Sterling called from the gate, his voice lacking its former arrogance. "I know I have no right to ask, but could I speak with you for a few minutes?" Elena instructed Maria to continue practicing with the amulet and walked outside to meet the man who had once threatened to destroy everything she held sacred. Up close, she could see that Sterling's transformation was more than superficial. The dark currents that had once flowed around him were gone, replaced by something that looked remarkably like genuine remorse. "I wanted to apologize," Sterling began, without preamble. "Not just for what I tried to do to your town, but for what I've spent my career doing to places like this all over the country." Eleanor studied his face, using the enhanced perception her guardian role had granted her. "What changed?" Sterling was quiet for a long moment, looking past her toward the ancient oak where the heartstone rested hidden beneath the earth. "After I left here, everything I touched turned to dust. Projects I'd been working on for years collapsed overnight. Business partners abandoned me. Financial backing disappeared. It was like the universe was trying to tell me something I'd been too stubborn to hear. The corruption you served doesn't protect its own servants," Elena said with understanding rather than judgment. "When you failed to deliver what they wanted, they moved on to someone else. That's what terrifies me," Sterling admitted. "There are others like me out there, other developers working for the same interests that sent me here. They won't give up just because one project failed." Elena felt the weight of responsibility that had become familiar over the past year. Each victory in protecting sacred places was balanced by the knowledge that the forces of destruction would simply redirect their efforts elsewhere. "What are you asking me, Mr. Sterling?" "Teach me how to recognize the places that should be protected," he said, his voice carrying desperate sincerity. "I spent years learning how to identify valuable development opportunities. Maybe I could use that knowledge to help communities defend themselves before the destroyers arrive." Elena looked at the Guardian, who had moved closer during their conversation. The magnificent stallion studied Sterling with ancient eyes, and Elena felt his assessment flowing through their mental link. The man's transformation was genuine, his remorse real, and his offer could be valuable to communities that lacked Millbrook's mystical advantages. "The path of a Guardian isn't easy," Elena warned him. "It requires abandoning everything you thought you knew about success and power." "I don't have anything left to abandon," Sterling replied with bitter honesty. Everything I built was hollow anyway. Elena made her decision with the same instinctive certainty that had driven her into the icy river to save a dying horse. Come back tomorrow morning? We'll start with teaching you to see the silver threads that connect sacred places. If you're serious about this, you'll need to learn to recognize what you once tried to destroy. As Sterling drove away, Elena felt the satisfaction of knowing that their network had just gained an unexpected ally, someone who understood the enemy's tactics from the inside and could help other communities prepare for battles they didn't yet know were coming. 2 years had passed since that frozen morning, when Elena had waded into the river to save a dying horse, and the changes to her life still amazed her when she paused to consider them. This evening she sat in her cottage with a leather-bound journal, carefully recording the wisdom she'd gained for the guardians who would come after her. The teaching journal had become one of her most important responsibilities. Future protectors would need more than instinct and good intentions. They would need practical knowledge about recognizing sacred sites, communicating with mystical allies, and defending against the increasingly sophisticated methods that developers like Sterling's former employers used to corrupt protected places. Elena's handwriting had evolved over the months, becoming more flowing and graceful, as if the act of recording guardian wisdom had changed even her penmanship. Tonight's entry focused on a lesson she'd learned just that week. The importance of teaching children to see beyond the ordinary world before skepticism could close their minds to deeper truths. A soft knock at her door interrupted her writing. Elena opened it to find young Tommy Martinez, now 13, and showing the gangly awkwardness of adolescence. But with eyes that held depths, she recognized in all those touched by guardian heritage. "Mrs. Vasquez," Tommy said quietly, "something's happening at my house. My mom sent me to get you." Elena grabbed her coat and followed Tommy through the quiet streets of Millbrook. The town had settled into its new identity as a protected sanctuary, with streetlights that seemed to burn a little brighter and gardens that bloomed a little longer than nature usually allowed. The Guardian's presence had infused the entire valley with gentle enhancements that made everyday life subtly more beautiful. The Martinez house glowed with warm yellow light, but Elena could see streams of silver energy flowing around the building like ribbons in an invisible wind. Mrs. Martinez met them at the front door, her face showing the mixture of wonder and concern that Elena had learned to recognize in families where mystical abilities were beginning to manifest. "It's Pablo," Mrs. Martinez explained, leading them toward the back bedroom where Tommy's 8-year-old brother lay sleeping. "He's been having dreams about the mountains, talking in his sleep about voices calling him to the high places. But tonight," Elena stepped into the bedroom and immediately understood the situation. Pablo was floating 6 inches above his mattress, his small body surrounded by a gentle aura of silver light. His face was peaceful, but his lips moved constantly as if he were carrying on an important conversation with invisible companions. "The mountain spirits have chosen him," Elena said softly, recognizing the signs from her studies of other guardian lineages. "Some children are called to protect the high places, while others are drawn to valleys and rivers. Pablo has the gift of the peaks." Mrs. Martinez sank into the chair beside her son's bed. "Is he in danger? Should we wake him?" Elena shook her head, placing a gentle hand on the worried mother's shoulder. "He's perfectly safe. The spirits wouldn't harm someone they're calling to serve. But you'll need to prepare for changes in your family's life." As if responding to Elena's words, Pablo's eyes opened, though they glowed with the same silver light that surrounded his floating form. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that seemed to echo from vast distances. "The peaks need protection," he said in a tone far too mature for his years. "The miners are coming to the sacred caves. The old agreements are being broken." Elena felt her heart sink. She'd been expecting this development, but had hoped for more time to prepare. The corruption that had targeted Millbrook was spreading, seeking other vulnerable points in the network of sacred places that protected the region. "How long do we have?" she asked Pablo's spirit-touched consciousness. "The digging begins with the spring thaw. The eagles are already leaving their ancient nests." Elena nodded, understanding the implications. If the mountain spirits were reaching out to an 8-year-old boy in Millbrook, the situation in the high country must be desperate. The mystical protections that had kept the peaks safe for centuries were failing, and new guardians would need to be awakened quickly. She looked at Mrs. Martinez with compassion for the difficult choice the family would soon face. "Pablo will need training that I can't provide here. There are guardian communities in the mountains, people who understand the high places and can teach him what he needs to know." The silver light around Pablo began to fade as his conversation with the mountain spirits concluded. He settled gently back onto his mattress, returning to ordinary sleep. But Elena could see that he would never again be an ordinary child. The network was expanding faster than she'd anticipated, calling children and adults alike to protect sacred places throughout the region. Elena returned to her cottage that night, knowing that her teaching journal would need new chapters, and that the quiet phase of Millbrook's transformation was coming to an end. Dawn came to Millbrook Valley with the same gentle splendor it had brought for countless generations, but Elena experienced it now with a depth of perception that would have seemed impossible just 2 years ago. She stood in her garden beside the guardian, watching the sun paint the mountains in shades of rose and gold, while the eternal flame that burned in the crystal chamber beneath the ancient oak pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. The flame had appeared on the anniversary of the Heartstone's awakening, a manifestation of the unbreakable bond between the guardian and the human protector who served alongside him. It required no fuel and produced no smoke, burning with the pure energy of the covenant that had kept the valley safe for generations. Elena had learned to read the flame's subtle changes, understanding that its steady glow meant all was well in the network of protected places that now stretched across 3 continents. The white stallion stood beside her with the patient majesty of a being who had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations while remaining constant in his purpose. Their mental connection had deepened over the months until Elena sometimes forgot where her thoughts ended and his began. Though she remained fully herself, simply expanded beyond what she had once believed possible. "We've done something remarkable here," Elena said softly, her voice carrying across the peaceful garden. "When I saved you from that frozen river, I thought I was just rescuing one animal. I had no idea I was preserving an entire way of being in the world." The Guardian's response flowed through their link with warmth that made her chest glow with contentment. "You understood what mattered most even when you couldn't name it. Compassion without expectation of reward. Protection without thought of personal cost. These are the qualities that make someone worthy of the ancient trust." Elena touched the transformed pendant that had become her badge of office, feeling its steady pulse of silver light that marked her as a protector of sacred places. The simple seamstress who had once lived quietly at the edge of town seemed like a different person now, though Elena knew she carried that woman's essential qualities forward into her expanded role. The sound of approaching footsteps drew her attention to the path that led from town. A small group of visitors was making its way toward her cottage, led by Dr. Chen, and including several people Elena didn't recognize. Among them was a young woman whose bearing suggested she carried guardian heritage, and an elderly man whose eyes held the depth that came from years of protecting sacred knowledge. "Helena," Dr. Chen called as the group reached the garden gate. "I'd like you to meet Dr. Sarah Windfeather from the Indigenous Sacred Sites Protection Network and Professor William Hastings from the Oxford Institute for Folklore Studies. They've come to discuss expanding our teaching programs." Elena welcomed the visitors with the gracious hospitality that had become second nature since Millbrook had opened its doors to seekers from around the world. But as she led them toward the cottage, she caught sight of something that made her pause in wonder. High above the valley, a flight of eagles circled in patterns that had nothing to do with hunting or navigation. Their formation created symbols in the sky that matched the protective sigils carved into the heartstone. And Elena realized that Pablo Martinez's training in the high country was already bearing fruit. The mountain spirits had accepted him as their human partner, and the peaks were once again under proper protection. As the morning progressed and Elena shared tea with her visitors, she found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The frightened, grieving widow, who had lost herself in routine and solitude, had been transformed into someone who served as a bridge between worlds, helping others discover their own capacity for protecting what truly mattered. The guardian stood at the window, his silver coat catching the morning light as he watched over his valley with eternal vigilance. Elena felt his contentment flowing through their bond, the deep satisfaction of a protector whose trust had been well placed and whose purpose was being fulfilled through partnership rather than solitary duty. The story isn't ending, Elena murmured to herself as she watched Dr. Windfeather demonstrate traditional blessing techniques to Professor Hastings. It's expanding. The eternal flame pulsed brighter for a moment, as if acknowledging her understanding that what had begun with one woman's act of compassion had grown into something that would continue long after she was gone, protected by the unbreakable bond between those who guard the sacred and those who recognize that some treasures are too precious to be lost to the march of time and the hunger of those who see only profit where others see the divine.